put you on the track. The measures you created and thought through are measures taken ultimately by a state, so the public authority, be it quasi-independent or not. And the framework that is bounding that public activity is also called administrative law. And the reason to dive as sort of intermezzo into administrative law is to give you the tools to think of which measure we logically could develop is appropriate and allowed, and which is sort of not allowed anymore. And so the suggestion to put the company into self-help group with the other companies, basically forcing client companies to visit a meeting where the wrongdoer is talking, and the question is the state allowed to sort of enforce that? If this is done voluntarily, okay. But are you then able to actually push that company, you should go to a meeting? And the answer to that question, the measure stick, is our logic still allowed, or are we freaking out? And do we move to sort of dictatorship? The answer is in administrative law. Administrative law is developed in the last 150 years in the current form. But it already exists for thousands of years. For instance, in China, where you have a centralized state with civil servants who are exactly doing what the central authority is wanting in a professional way. And so to become a civil servant in the Chinese empires over the 1,000 years, you needed to take an exam. And then with the skills you were allowed to be a public official, as is it right now. In Europe we had another system. And in some countries you still have the alternative system that if you're the brother of the ruler, then you get a job. So not based on a diploma, but based on your gene. Which not necessarily leads to civil servants that have merit. And so administrative law is about a centralized power with a skilled civil servant, and then it makes sense. It is, as the Germans and the Americans call, concretized constitutional law. So we all know constitutions, you know, the basic design of the state. But how does it work in all these various aspects of the state and the society? That is then called administrative law. So constitutional law is who's the president, where's the parliament, and then administrative law, also public law, is then the rest of the story. In the UK Commonwealth, it's administrative law is seen as the Magna Carta, the limits of the state, based on the rights of the citizen. And the French regard administrative law a little bit the same as the Germans and Americans, as the concretization of public law that they developed in the last 200 years, and let's say specific branches, and they say, well, it's key that there's a sort of administrative procedural law. So how do you communicate citizen state apart from election days, and the public service? And then in the international organizations, there's also international administrative law. How are these organizations organized? And I call it fusion kitchen lawyering of, so the sort of mixture of all those national traditions. And what is it about? It's about the interface between you and the state, society and the state. So administrative law is just the body of rules and guidelines that dictates the interface and the interaction between private entities, companies, and the state. There are two goals. One, the protection of the private sphere against a super overarching powerful state. Protecting, trying to protect that the state takes over your life and my life and company's life. This is the rowing and the steering decision. And 2, checks and balances for the functioning. So if you come from Mars, you see every 4 years elections, and that is where you steer your state. But the day after the elections, they are active, the state. And administrative law gives more checks and balances with various tools other than the elections, if any. This is connected to the goals about accountability, which is probably a word you've met in this year. And so connected to the protection against the state, it's the rights-based accountability. So how accountable is the state vis-à-vis the rights I have? And in Europe they're enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. And in the United States they're enshrined in the amendments to the Constitution. So each state has a sort of little catalogue of rights. And the state should be accountable. As in, can you address wrongdoing? And 2, performance and policy making accountability we will discuss next week. Tools are the civil servant I just mentioned. And then established principles. 2 more minutes. Hang in. And as a reading tool for the literature of this week, I give you this slide. That you have principles connected to the legitimacy. So in all the arrangements you should develop, or all the arrangements you propose, and suggestions you do, should be not against a law. So if there's a law protecting the company, then your creative idea cannot go against the law. 2, the actions you do should be based on a law. So to avoid that today afternoon we declare ourselves to the Dutch Inspectorate of Happiness, and then we start to intervene with people and say, don't walk out of the main entrance because that limits your happiness, or other stupid things. And then no act, which is an important one in our course, if you do not have the authority to mingle in. So the Food and Health Inspectorate should deal with cigarettes, not with trains. And the Transport Inspectorate should deal with trains. So that you're not having 2 agencies on your hands. So legitimacy. 2, a whole list of quality. As in non-discrimination, that it should be transparent, that you're not misusing your power, and the one we already met, proportionality. A small fine, a big fine. And how proportionate is it in relationship to the wrongdoing? And last but not least, justiciability. So, is there an independent judge at the end of the road? That if the other checks and balances are not satisfactory, that you can address the behavior of the state in a court of law. So 3 sort of key features of principles of administrative law. And the literature you're required to read is literature of international comparative administrative law. So how are these sort of public law principles on administrative law, how do they look like? And ultimately they come from sort of logical sources. I invite you to read those articles and get a sort of taste of those principles. And together with the logic you mobilize thanks to the 2 pyramids, you have 2 tools to develop, let's say, interventions in your role as either inspectorate or in a company to protect against the interventions, and the tools to have sort of ammunition to argue, to advise, and to make decisions. So I'm looking forward to next week, in which you will have this reading. along this sort of slide that helps you to focus. And then we look closer at the various sanctions of those inspections. Thank you for your attention. See you next week.